I'll avoid the pen. Hi, everybody. John, I think a lot of people in the audience may be somewhat familiar with your work, even if they don't know it's your work, through the interactive tool they saw in the Upshot in the New York Times, where you could punch in your college and learn about the income distribution of the students there. But obviously, the research went a lot further than that. Can you give us the highlights of what you learned about both access and outcomes for students at different points on the income scale in the higher education system?
Sure. So what we did is measured the distribution of family income for students that are going to each school in the country. That's what we call access, the fraction of students from low-income backgrounds. And then we also measured how those students do 15 years after they got into school in their mid-30s to understand the impact of each college on intergenerational mobility. And we had a number of findings, but I think that from an intergenerational mobility perspective, the most important is that there's some set of schools that we don't typically think of as being those great engines that really stand out.
Yes, let's talk about that, because you discuss in the report mobility rates, right, which is the share of students who enroll in a college from a family in the bottom 20% of the income distribution and who end up in the top fifth, in the top 20%. What kinds of colleges were the most successful in taking the greatest number of students from the bottom fifth to the top fifth?
So what really surprised us is that it was not elite schools, even state flagship schools didn't really stand out. What really stood out were selective public institutions, but towards the bottom end of the four-year tier. So, for instance, the single largest, most impressive mobility rate school in the country is Cal State LA, in fact. Also CUNY, SUNY Stony Brook, University of Texas El Paso. These are a number of schools that really jumped to the top.
You mentioned Stony Brook, so let's call for that first slide, if we could. We have a slide, and this is the kind of data that you collected, a mobility report card comparing Columbia versus SUNY Stony Brook. Tell everybody what they're seeing here.
Sure. So this gives for both Columbia and SUNY Stony Brook kind of the key data that come out of our analysis, and you can get this online for any school in the country. So first on access, this is where the family incomes where the students are coming from. Those are the bars just showing the distribution of family income. And so for instance, at SUNY Stony Brook, 16% of kids are coming from families in the bottom quintile. That's earning at less than an average of $25,000 a year. And then the dots with the line across the top show how each of those types of students do once they get out into the labor force in their mid-30s. And so what that's saying is that from SUNY Stony Brook, about half of those poor kids go on to earn in the top 20% of the income distribution, which is more than about $60,000 a year.
Now, Columbia, the tilt obviously is much more. If you look at five, their tilt is much more towards students in the top.
That's right, and this is very typical of elite private schools. More than 70% of students at Columbia come from families in the richest fifth of the income distribution, and just 5% of kids come from the poorest families.
One statistic I think that really jumps out to anyone who reads the report is that in what you call Ivy Plus, which is the Ivy League plus Stanford, MIT, University of Chicago, and Duke. I don't know if that was chosen by basketball or. There are in the Ivy Plus, there are more students from parents in the top 1% than in the bottom 50% combined. How does it get that lopsided?
That's right, and I think what this is telling us is two things. First of all, that these schools are not going to as great lengths as they could, we think, to reach out to those very talented students that are coming from disadvantaged backgrounds. But also it tells us something about the opportunities that are available to these students at younger ages. It's not just that this magically happens when students apply to high school. This is the natural endpoint of everything that's been going on through 12 years or more of education.
By the way, the numbers are not great for the flagship public universities either. In fact, their mobility rate overall is lower, I think, in your study than the Ivy Plus, because their access is also relatively low
That's
for low-income kids. So we're talking about when you show flagship publics, you mean Ann Arbor, Madison.
That's right. So there's some flagship publics like University of California at Berkeley that look pretty similar to Columbia, for instance, but they admit about 10% of their students from poor families, which is really a lot for schools in that tier. But many state flagship schools have only 3, 4, 5% of their students from poor families, and that's just the same as some of these Ivy Plus schools, except the outcomes aren't as good.
Let me ask you, I'm glad you brought that up about the outcomes. When you look at the overall mobility rate, it's essentially two questions, right? It's the how many of low income kids they let in to begin with, and then how many of them reach the top. So their success at helping them make the bridge. Is the difference in schools primarily big gaps in the share of low income kids who once they get in ultimately get into the top fifth of the income distribution, or is the key variable how many of them they let in the first place?
So we see schools doing it in both ways. There are some schools like SUNY Stony Brook here where the outcomes are really excellent, and 16% of kids from poor families is a lot for a very selective school, but compared to community colleges or often non-selective four-year schools, it's not that high. There are also schools that do similarly well from mobility by letting in many, many more students from poor families. The outcomes aren't as good, but still, because they're lifting a good number of them into the top of the income distribution, they're contributing a lot to mobility as well.
Did you examine at all what are the strategies in the schools that have the best records? Leaving aside how many they let in, once the kids are there, the schools that do the best, what are some of the approaches that they've taken? What have you learned about that?
So to be totally honest, this is the next big question. Our data just tell us where a student went and then where they're coming from and where they're going. We don't have that much fine-grained data inside the institutions. And so what we're trying to do to move this project forward is to partner with institutions to get more data about what's going on inside the school. What programs are students taking? Are they part of a mentoring program? If they're living on campus, what dorm are they living in? To try to understand, take a school like SUNY Stony Brook, what is exactly that they're doing that allows them to produce such good outcomes for so many poor students?
Let's bring up the next slide if we could. I said if we could. And there it is. Now this looks at access. Explain to everybody what this is. This is access to different kinds of institution for kids from lower income families. And what does it tell us?
That's right. So we've got on the vertical axis the fraction of students at different types of schools that come from low income families. And then we're tracking that over about 12 years in our sample. And what you see, for instance, that red line at the top there, that's for-profit colleges. So the largest increase in access for poor students has been 2 for-profit colleges. Now, there aren't quite as many of them, so the community colleges, which are in the 2-year, it's like the second highest line,
Right, the
have
gray.
also absorbed a large fraction of the new college attendees. And this is a population that's been increasing faster than any other in the population in terms of college attendance rates. Now,
Go ahead.
I was going to say, unfortunately, at the bottom, what we see, if you look at the green and the kind of maroon purple line, those are the Ivy Plus colleges and other elite schools. And what we've seen is small gains in the Ivy Plus schools and actually decline in access at some of the other elite schools. And so this is not as encouraging as we might have hoped, given the tremendous focus that's been put on access over the past 15
And I'll
years.
stay there because, I mean, there has been a tremendous focus on access at those elite Ivy and Ivy Plus schools. But you make an interesting argument in the paper. You argue that because these mid-tier publics have comparable success at much lower per student expenditures in terms of moving kids up the income ladder, that in terms of a mass strategy, it may be more cost effective to focus on bolstering those mid-tier public institutions than to put so much effort per se on getting a few more kids through the eye of the needle into the Ivy League?
I think that's right. And Harvard is very expensive per student. It's a pretty small place, all things considered. And so when you think about a broad-based solution to upward mobility in this country, trying to expand Harvard itself is not that successful. Trying to say to a regional four-year school, hey, if only you can become like Harvard, we can be a lot better, I don't think that's going to be a great strategy either. But what we saw is that, just like in the comparison between SUNY, Stony Brook, and Columbia, it's not the case that there's just an iron trade-off where having more poor students at your school means you must have lower outcomes. There are schools like SUNY Stony Brook that really are able to produce excellent outcomes with a very large number of poor students. And I think that those kind of mid-tier selective or non-selective four-year public schools provide a scalable model. Educational expenses are only $6,000 or $7,000 per student per year.
Compared to what in the Ivy
Compared
Plus?
to about $80,000 at the average Ivy League school.
Yeah. Now but you note that despite that success, access for lower income students is actually falling at those mid-tier public institutions that are producing the best results. And you speculate that rising tuition as states withdraw public dollars may have something to do with that.
That's right. What we see at places just like SUNY Stony Brook is that they have far fewer students from poor families as a fraction of their student body now than they did 15 years ago. And I think there are some reasons where that might be acceptable. Maybe they're really trying to become more selective. They're doing even better things with slightly fewer poor students. I think there are other explanations like the lack of public funding, which are much more insidious. And I think that we really need to understand better what's been happening over the last 15 years so that we can try to fix this trend.
So there is now a dialogue happening in a lot of different places about tuition-free access to higher education. Tennessee and Oregon have done it for the two-year schools. Rhode Island, where you are, is talking
That's
about
right.
it for the two-year schools. New York, in a kind of back to the future moment from when I was growing up in New York, has restored, saying it's restored tuition-free for both 2 and 4 years up to a certain income level. California is talking about it. Obviously, there's discussion at the national level with Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. How effective a strategy do you think tuition-free would be about expanding this kind of access?
So I think that getting more kids to go to college is great. And even though it doesn't cost that much, just having it be free and not having them have to figure out how to get 17 different grants to pay for it is valuable. I think what our research highlights, though, is that it's not just whether you go to college, but where you go to college that matters and what you do when you get there. And I think that the differences across schools within a tier, across different community colleges, across non-selective four-year publics, even in the same area, right? We're not going to have somebody go to community college all the way across the country, but where there's choice, I think where you go to school and what you do there may be just as important as going to school in the first place.
There's been some hesitation on the left about the 4-year free model out of the fear that a lot of upper middle class kids with better test scores, higher GPAs because of the schools they attended, who might otherwise go to a private school will say, hey, if SUNY Binghamton, where I went, is free, maybe I'll go here, and that you have a crowding out effect, and you might ultimately, even a tuition free, you could end up without the right safeguards with even fewer kids from lower income backgrounds.
Yeah, and that's, I think, certainly a reasonable concern. There's evidence from a program in Massachusetts, the John Adams Scholarship, which did exactly that. It made any UMass school free, and what you really saw is students transferring in from, or not transferring, but choosing to attend, say, UMass Amherst instead of a private school in nearby states. Now, in terms of the effect on the student body as a whole, that depends what the colleges do with those extra students. If they're going to crowd out students from disadvantaged backgrounds that otherwise would have had a spot, then obviously that's not great. If it serves to provide a more diverse and vibrant student atmosphere, then maybe that's okay.
We'll bring in the audience for questions in a minute, but this gets to, I think, a really critical point in this whole debate, and that is the question of whether the elite institutions, whether public or private, could admit more lower income kids, perhaps with slightly lesser credentials in terms of test scores and grades, and still have them succeed. You say in the report, in the slide presentation of the report, quote, any current affirmative action policies for low income students have little to no cost to universities in terms of student outcomes. So could the elite schools admit more lower income and minority students and still see them succeed?
I think they could. And can we bring the first slide back up?
First slide.
So what we'll see when this comes up is that students, right here, so the dark blue line across the top is how students from Columbia, from each of the 5 quintiles, do when they get out in the labor force. And we see that students from poor families and from rich families, just about 65% of them are getting into the top 20%. And so what that's saying is that the poor students who are at Columbia right now are doing just fine. They're doing essentially as well as everybody else. And I think that that's suggestive that not if you went all the way down to the bottom of the pool, but if you took the next person and the next person and the next person after that, you'd have substantial room to find more qualified students from disadvantaged backgrounds to round out the class.
And this goes to what is, whenever higher education leaders are presented with this sort of data, often the first point of fallback is, look, the problem isn't us, the problem is the K-12 system. That it's simply not equipping enough kids from lower income neighborhoods to succeed at the highest level. Is that based on what you see, is that a fair defense, or in fact, do they have more room to reach a little deeper into the pool?
I mean, it's got to be a combination of both, right? This is not something that magically happens in the fall of senior year when students apply to college. But on the other hand, I think that schools can find more qualified kids from disadvantaged backgrounds in their pool if they make that a priority. And we are looking to partner with these elite schools to try to help them find these students. I think that's really a critical direction out of our work to try to figure out how is it that we can expand access at these schools.
You know, we've done research at the Atlantic working with PolicyLink, a group that you know, that's showing that in virtually every major city, even the most economically thriving, most African American and Hispanic kids attend schools, K-12 schools, where a majority of their classmates qualify as poor or low income. I mean, it's true in Newark, it's true in Detroit, but it's also true in Seattle and Austin and San Jose. I mean, the Equality of Opportunity Project looks more broadly at school than just at schools. Can we get to a point where we have a true opportunity for kids without more opportunity for adults?
Well, I think that so just to start, right, at the Equality of Opportunity Project, we're trying to produce similar statistics like this. We've already done it for counties, but we're doing it for census tracts, really, what you might think of as a neighborhood. And I think that those data show the same thing, that growing up in concentrated poverty where there's segregation on either income or race, those are not places with a lot of upward mobility. And so I think that providing opportunity for kids, the great thing is that can help us all, right? It's not just that we're displacing some other person from a job they would have had, but that a poor student grows up to have a patent and that helps everybody, or to create a company, or to discover a cure. This is really, I think, about allowing all of these kids to contribute to their potential to the country.
And as we're bringing the audience here, but as we were noting backstage, we are already at a point where a majority of the K-12 public school students in the country are kids of color. Sometime around 2025, a majority of the high school graduates in the country will be kids of color. And you find yourself thinking, how long can you have a system that essentially apportions all of the best opportunities to kids who have the good sense to be born into it, as those underlying demographics continue to change so dramatically?
I think that's right. And we know that even in this country, it's not the case that mobility is low everywhere. There's some very high mobility places, there's some low mobility places, there's some high mobility colleges, there's low mobility colleges. We know that there are examples that can do it, and I think that we just have to adjust in this way as these demographics change.
All right, we have time for a couple questions. We have one back here.
Oh, hi. My name is Justin, and the focus of education is always kind of set to school as a physical environment, but a lot of the learning that we get is from just the integrated spaces that we share, and also having the opportunity to produce that or further that learning through an internship, and just the focus on really getting those applicable skills through work experience, which is, I mean, for personally, I think the internship I had during college was the most I learned the whole time, integrating with people. And do you see any future for that in terms of, you're maybe getting money instead of having to pay it for taking courses that you might not be applicable for that, those individuals?
Yeah, so I think that the value and the contribution that a university makes goes well beyond the classes that you take. It's about the students you interact with, the activities that you do, the jobs you have, the internships you have, all of that. And I think that we are trying to, through these school partnerships, really dig inside this, these data. What is it that SUNY Stony Brook is doing? If providing internships for kids from disadvantaged families that don't have the connections themselves to get them, that's a possible answer, and we want to find it out.
In the back, we got one.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Kim from Reach Incorporated. We hire high school students to tutor elementary school students. And as we work in providing opportunities for our kids to go to specific universities, we are finding this stop where our kids can't afford, or not schools, because their guidance counselors have a lot of caseloads, aren't able to focus on the right school for the right student. So I want to know, how are you partnering with public schools to provide the information that you have to help nonprofits and schools gear their kids to the right schools where they can succeed?
I think that's very important, and I think we've been trying to figure out a way to take these data and get them in front of students who are making choices. Now, I think we got to be a little bit careful with the numbers as I've presented to them right now, because, right, Columbia and SUNY Stony Brook have very good outcomes, partly because the kids that go there are quite talented to begin with. And so we want to make sure that we can isolate the value of a degree to each student rather than just saying that there are a bunch of smart kids at each school. If anything, that's going to reinforce this message where the selective public schools are going to look even better. But I think it's exactly right. We want to get this information in front of students in as transparent a way as possible because too often they're not able to navigate through the complex landscape themselves.
Let's squeeze in one more.
Hi, Robin Brazeley, and I'm from Hempstead, which is a community with low-performing public schools. And I just have an idea I'd like you to consider. Why not use charter school legislation, target those communities that have low-performing schools to get that low-income student population that has really been denied a measurable opportunity to learn. And using charter school legislation, help get them ready in those last 1 or 2 years of high school for success in these competitive college environments that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think that there's no question that in a number of places, charter schools have done really incredible things with kids from many different disadvantaged backgrounds. There are places where charter schools have been less successful, so I think it's important how you set them up, not just that you set them up, but I certainly think that it's a great idea and that can be a part of the solution to get kids to the point of college with more preparedness and they can go to a more selective school.
John, you've given us a huge amount to think about, and probably a lot of people want to follow up. So where can they find this? Where's the easiest place to find
All the
what you're
data
doing?
are on the Equality of Opportunity Project website. Type it into Google, it'll come up. We have data on neighborhoods, data on schools, and love to hear from people who are out there in the community with ideas and people who want to work with us to try to understand things better.
Join me in thanking John Friedman.
Thank you very much.